the Cold War, looking at the arms race and China specifically. After the Berlin airlift, we're basically going to see three big events are going to frame America's mindset on the Cold War. The first of these is going to be in 1949 in September, Truman is going to announce that the Soviet Union tests their own atomic bomb. A month later, we're going to see the second event, which is communists under Mao Zedong are going to take power in China. And then the third will be the Korean War. So, looking at the first of these three big events, this really wasn't a surprise to most experts that the Soviet Union had made their own atomic bomb. But it does dismay your average Americans. And on top of that, it doesn't help that newspapers would scare readers with these renditions of what kind of effect an atomic bomb would have if it landed on New York or Chicago. And so this is going to kind of shock the American public, and it really tilts a lot of United States nuclear policy more and more towards military uses. And for a while we'd seen that we were moving towards more of a civilian control, but now it's back to weaponry more than anything else. We're going to see Truman authorize work on a super bomb that is actually going to become known as the H-bomb or the hydrogen bomb. Really, we're going to see nuclear weapons proliferate in the early 1950s. America is going to repeatedly test nuclear fission weapons in Nevada, but they're going to test their first hydrogen bomb in the South Pacific in 1952. The hydrogen bomb is so much bigger. It has about 100 times the energy of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Literally, the detonation from this test is going to tear a mile-long chasm in the ocean floor. I should also mention in that same year, Great Britain actually became the third nuclear power in the world. The thing is, the Soviet Union is catching up to the United States when it comes to atomic weaponry. The Soviet Union, in fact, would test their first H-bomb only 9 months after the United States. And this was really concerning because a lot of the population remembered, the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so this is really going to lead to a nuclear arms race. And then there's this fear of nuclear war multiplying apprehensions about the Cold War. Americans are going to tune in at all times for emergency information, and they'd hear air raid sirens, and children would learn how to hide under their desks if there was a nuclear attack. Not that that would much help, but the other thing is nuclear weapon development is going to generate all kinds of new environmental and health problems, because basically people are going to be exposed to radiation with very minimal protection. One place in particular is the Pacific Islanders in the South Pacific are going to be forced to basically abandon their contaminated homes. And we see things like increased cancer rates amongst those who are the so-called downwinders in places like Utah, plus just huge environmental costs for later generations. I should warn you though, when we're talking about cancer rates and things like that, one of the most famous examples of this is the movie known as The Conqueror, that a lot of people died over the years, and people go, oh, it was connected. Actually, weirdly enough, that particular movie wasn't. It's actually pretty average. You have to keep in mind smoking rates were really high at this time, and just there were other health issues as well that caused a lot of people to die on that particular movie set and everything. But I bring it up because there was still increased cancer rates amongst the population on a whole and everything. This brings us to the second event, China. Once again, the fact that communists managed to take over China really shouldn't have been that surprising. It was actually pretty predictable. The collapse of Jiang Zexi's national regime was basically inevitable. And I really hate using that word, but it almost was because of all the corruption, and he had just such narrow support. But still, critics in the United States are going to look for scapegoats. Who can we blame for this? Unfortunately, Foreign Service officers who had actually honestly analyzed the weakness of the nationalists in China are basically going to be accused of being communist sympathizers and hounded from their jobs. They were basically unfairly branded as traitors in the United States. The thing about a lot of this is you have to remember that, like, even during World War II, Europe really had been the United States' first priority. And so this is going to bring us to the NSC 68. Basically, this is going to be an extension of the Truman Doctrine, and it's convincing many Americans of like the threat of nuclear war. The NSC 68 is technically the National Security Council Paper 68. This paper split the world basically into forces of so-called slavery and so-called freedom. And it assumed that the Soviet Union's aggressiveness was motivated by like greed for territory and a fanatic faith in communism. And so this particular paper put forward the idea that the United States really had to use force to resist communist expansion. Keep in mind, up to this point, America had always tried to contain communism via like diplomacy, or the big one was getting involved in the economies of places like Europe and Japan. So now this is arguing that the United States needs to go further. It needs to press like friendly nations into rearming themselves and making former enemies into allies. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of, so to speak. It's also going to advocate for open-ended increases in the defense budget. So really what the NSC is doing more than anything else is it's summing up what a lot of people believed at this time, because it wasn't really a public document. And when we get to the outbreak of war in Korea and the end of June of 1950, this is basically just seeming to confirm all of these concerns about a communist expansion, and that it really is a military threat, and therefore America needs to have like a flexible military response and have a much more active intervention response.